Hi, folks. So, in our part two, in discussing the royal arts of Africa, we're going to look at another kingdom in West Africa where the artifacts that exist are a very important part of what constitutes the royal regalia, the royal presence through these rare commodities and other forms of royal expression. Before we begin to talk about Benin Kingdom, I want to broadly talk about another aspect of royal kingship that is addressed in the Igbo, which are neighbors of the Benin Kingdom, and they are a part of a kind of wider pattern of royal power and privilege that is described in this very famous novel, Things Fall Apart by Achebe, which I highly recommend. It's a really brilliant and evocative story about the transformation of traditional African societies when they come in contact with Western missionary work. And in this book is described this idea of age grade, where we have this sort of things where the structure of the politics and the way people sort of advance and move up in the society. And it sort of talks about the way in which throughout the 10th century migrations, people were becoming more and more settled. Trade with Europe had begun, and there was a little bit more of a kind of formation of these kingdoms that through trade through the Sahara and also up and around, they were able to use these natural resources to great advantage, especially gold. Gold is a very important resource that was largely available throughout parts of West Africa. And so where it gets the idea of the Gold Coast, and gold is closely associated with many parts of this region. And so around the 15th and 16th century, you really start to see sort of much of what we're talking about here as these sort of established kingdoms that came into prominence. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of age grades and social networks. A generation in an African society sort of grows up together and goes through certain phases of life. And they're kind of bond together, and they identify themselves within this age group. And each of these age groups, as they advance in age, assume more and more social and political power. And as they go through certain rites of passage and other important steps in growing up within the society, the age grade allows certain individuals to advance and gain prominence and rewards and accolades within the age grade. And so they might move into more and more senior positions of authority. And so the whole society, as the older generation passes on, the next generation in the age grade sort of assumes the mantle of that earlier age. Kings are a certain age and family, but also must demonstrate leadership skills. So there is a hereditary component to being a king, but much of what establishes a king's authority, just as in these age grades, is what have you accomplished? What have you demonstrated? How have you been able to assert your authority within your age grade? And that's sort of an expected part of, growing and finding your place within this social network. So this kind of system of gradual advancement was an important way in which society had kind of created and developed a cohesive and coherent form. Of course, with the arrival of the Europeans, and then later with the slave trade, there was an enormous disruption of that natural progression. And the colonial powers, again, the hierarchy and the systems of natural advancement that had been in place quickly degraded and were exploited by the colonial powers. We'll talk more about that later. But just to say that there is this social structure that was in existence for a very long time, but has been largely disrupted through these major forces in globalization. Let's talk about the Benin Empire. And it's important not to confuse the empire Benin with the current kingdom called Benin, which is further to the west and is really a separate kingdom that doesn't really have that kind of ethnic connection to this ancient kingdom that thrived from this period we talked about, the 17th, 18th century. Benin Empire was a series of kingdoms that had a close connection to the god Olokun. So when you see the king today wearing red coral, again, as part of the ocean, a symbol of the king's right to take a human life, and as a symbol of this kind of power from the seas. And trading, as a trading kingdom, it was very important in here. Trading ivory and other valuable items and commodities from the interior was an important part of the Benin Empire. Here is the current Royal Majesty Oba Uduari II. Oba is the official title of the king of the Benin Empire. To honor deceased kings, the king has a number of important responsibilities in maintaining a shrine to his own ancestors, and all of the royal court has a shrine to their ancestors, which they honor by providing valuable art objects that they can display on the shrine. So this raised earthen mound is the spot that honors the ancestor, and there are these number of bronze objects that are displayed in this, where offerings and prayers are said. We see ivory tusks emerging out of the head. Those are carved ivory tusks. We'll talk more about those later. And so ivory and bronze are the primary objects from which the king has control and is able to then dole these out to other members of the royal court as a way of assuring that they have loyalty and demonstrate fealty to the king. So again, using rare, valuable materials and objects as a way of kind of directly engaging in their leadership and having people follow them in this effective manner. So the Agbon, the material world, is a way of kind of demonstrating wealth, prosperity that goes into the spirit world. So we know that these carvings on the ivory tusks relate to the different kings and their genealogies and their lives. And so there's a number of important symbols that are carved onto the figures. And the tusk is a spot where the kind of the genealogy of the king. This tusk here that we see is actually now visible in the African section of the Chicago Art Institute. If you haven't seen the new African section, it's really very impressive. Used to be a rather narrow hallway. But now it's this really lovely curated area that you should check out. And you'll see a number of Benin objects there. And we'll talk about how Chicago and other museums all over the world actually came to possess these things in a minute. So the 10th century Benin established a small kingdom, and in this political upheaval, they invited a Yoruba leader, the Oba, not Oranmiyan, to rule over the country. So the kingdom is really kind of established from a Yoruba leader, sort of invited in from the outside. And we talked about the importance of a ruler who has a kind of authority that transcends the sort of immediate family and immediate allegiances within groups in the kingdom. So when we look at this, I want to now examine some of the relief carvings on the tusk, and we'll look at some of the symbolism associated with the Oba Adolo and his reign. So the Queen Mother here, you see, is featured in the center of the tusk here, and in her royal household. And so she is attendant. The Queen Mother is a very important office that was established early on. The Queen Mother is the mother, the wife of the deceased king. Okay, so the king is deceased, and they usually marry young women. So the current king's mother is now given a kind of royal office, and this office continues today and is often in a way of kind of demonstrating the importance of women and the roles of women in the kingdom. So the Ioba is a very powerful symbol for the king himself to have in his own genealogy. It talks about his own heritage, that this is the woman who gave birth to me, and it connects to the feminine powers of his kingdom. And we see a lot of that kind of images in the royal court. Another very interesting image we find on this tusk is the mudfish. And the mudfish is a common symbol in the Benin Kingdom. It lives along the riverbank in this kind of shallow, murky waters, and so it's being a kind of amphibious creature. It has this ability to kind of rule over dual domains. It also has this very interesting attack that it captures and stuns fish and small creatures by exhibiting an electric shock. And so this idea of the mudfish being this kind of ability to punish and to dominate these two realms is a powerful symbol of the royal court. It's not a terribly flattering sounding name, mudfish, but among the Benin, it is a very appropriate royal insignia. We also see images of the elephant with a hand at the end of its trunk. This is an important idea of the king and his ability to command and do things. It's like the utility of an elephant's trunk and the articulation of a human hand. Another very interesting part of this tusk is in the very bottom, a depiction of Portuguese traders. And Portuguese traders were a very important part of the prestige of the king, that these Portuguese came so far away to honor the king and give gifts and trade. This is a part of the way in which the king demonstrates his role, that he is this focal point of great activity. The divinity of the Benin monarchy is linked to Osanbua, the creator god, and Olokun, his eldest son. And these are symbols that are part of this idea of the divinity here. Holding crocodiles by the tails is a sign of someone who has power over good fortune and the supernatural. We also see a double-headed serpent with a frog in each mouth as a kind of idea of wealth and prosperity, kind of the power of commanding fortune and fertility. This is an engraving from the 17th century. And it's a depiction by a European, I believe it was British, where showing the procession of the Ioba. And in it you see musicians, leopards, you'll see all kinds of dwarves and small people and musicians and soldiers all progressing on a parade. I want to call your attention to one depiction here. You'll notice a figure in the background here blowing on a horn. And these horns are ivory tusks that are still made today. And it's very important. You see how he's blowing on the end of the ivory tusk is a way of kind of signaling the arrival of the Yoruba. Now, interestingly, the horns that are made in Africa are blown across the side. They're not blown on end. They're actually a part of a different kind of horn. You see here they're signaling the king as they do now with this horn blowing. We do have some very interesting horns that were created from the 17th century. The Portuguese were very fond of the craftsmanship of the Benin craftsmen, ivory craftsmen. So they would have them make horns for themselves. And clearly, when we look at these horns, you'll notice that they are designed to blow on the end of the horn. Now, these kinds of horns are known as olifants. They're from their sort of mythic origin of the word elephant. And this is part of the extraordinary design work that comes into it. This sort of woven knot pattern you see on the banding is some of the original artistry of the thing. And we also see a number of other things that they've added to these carvings to appeal to Europeans. They've had a kind of a hunting scene and dogs and bows and arrows and deer. And they've even got a royal insignia that they have depicted for their European patrons. So this example here, these two horns, are examples of some of the earliest tourist art we have in Africa. Europeans buying objects for their own design and interest while visiting Africa. Another very important object in the Benin Kingdom are these bronze plaques, and these directly relate back to those mounds that we showed you earlier where they have for worshiping ancestors. Bronze was one of these elements that was closely controlled by the Benin king. The bronze foundry was within the royal compound, and the people who had found sufficient favor with the king were granted bronze to make plaques so that they could honor their own ancestors. And so we see these, very deep relief bronze plaques. They are a depiction of royal warriors and their attendants. And you can see they're dressed in royal regalia, brandishing ceremonial swords and shields. And here's another example of a royal regalia of the king. And you see the figure sort of emerging from the sort of decorated background. And I want to call attention to the background because the background is decorated with a very distinct purpose. It's a way of kind of signifying that the ancestor is sort of emerging out of this cosmic void, where the spirit world and this sort of decorated form that surrounds them is actually a part of this kind of merging with that spirit realm. The two common symbols, Owen, Oba Edeku, the sun never misses the day, is a symbol of royal insignia. The idea that there's this kind of the constant, that the sun is the royal power and that it's always there with the day. And then the more common theme, which is a little bit fainter now in the background, you'll see these Ibn Amin, the river leaves, this kind of floating river leaves, the sort of flower petals that decorate the background, creating this idea of deep water, associated with fertility, associated with a sense of the spirit world. It lies within the sort of deep underwater streams. Let's talk now about the important role of the Queen Mother. We had mentioned briefly here in the insignia on the tusks. And there's a very famous hip mask. Now, these are small masks, not worn on the face. This hip mask here is in the Met Museum, and there's another one very similar to it in the British Museum. And this was Oba Isigi, the king of Benin, to honor his mother Idia all the way back in the 16th century. And we see on this small hip mask, you'll notice that the current Oba has a series of sort of white shell-like things around his waist. That's literally what it is. It's a mask that would literally be worn on the hip. And these ivory masks, this one here in particular, is quite striking because if you look at the ornamental decoration around below the head and above the head, you'll see elephants, but you'll also see these sort of bearded people, which represent the Portuguese traders. So Idia was the first of the women to assume the role of the Queen Mother and the role of the Ioba. And so she plays a very important role in kind of defining this job and what it's like. What's interesting about the Ioba and the imagery associated with it is that mothers and motherhood are typically depicted in Africa for their fertility, childbearing. But clearly the Ioba is a woman who is past that. She is an older woman, and her symbols of power are very distinctive. She's shown in many ways to appear both as a woman, but also as a high-ranking court official. And her sexuality is diminished. In representation of her sexuality is diminished. We also see a number of heads that represent the Queen Mother. In the past, the sort of middle period, 16th to late 17th century, we see a kind of rounded, taller coral crown that the Ioba would have worn. And later on, from the 17th to 18th century, the faces become more stylized and the crowns become smaller and sharper and kind of parrot beak is how they're usually described. It's kind of sharp pointed and sort of the more recent of the depictions of the Queen Mother. So the Benin Kingdom was coming into a collision course with the British, who had a number of trading agreements with Benin Kingdom. And the Benin people were sort of hesitantly getting into these agreements because the British were beginning to demand more and more. And what happened in the expedition of 1897 was Ralph Moore was a very aggressive about expanding British trade in the area. And he continued to try and press the Benin Kingdom and the current Ioba at the time for exclusive trade deals, which the Ioba was hesitant to grant. It meant that the British subjects in the Benin Kingdom were only subject to British law, and that all agreements that they made with other kingdoms had to be first approved by Britain, and that they were to forthwith stop all human sacrifice as a part of capital punishment and part of ritual practices. And so in this agreement, the Ioba was kind of hiding in their palace, not wanting to meet the British, and at the same time, very busy with ritual preparations for a very elaborate ceremony that he was undertaking. And the British, continued to insist on a meeting with the king, and the king continued to insist that he was busy. Finally, Ralph Moore decides he's going to take this initiative. He led a band into the interior toward the kingdom. And when they got word that he and an expedition were on their way and going to force their way into the kingdom, the palace, during these festivities, a number of kings, royal court people, ambushed Ralph Moore and his following and killed them all, except one, who escaped back to the camp on the shore and was able to sail back to England. Of course, this absolutely horrified the public in England, and thus began the British punitive expedition, which then was launched with the express purpose of absolutely destroying the Benin Kingdom. They came in with their Gatling guns and cannons, and they just laid waste to everything, destroyed, pillaged, and when they got there, much of the palace was just already abandoned. The Benin knew that this was up, that the British were going to come and attack, so they fled into the jungle. So the British ransacked the palace, burned and destroyed what they could not pull up and bring home for sale. And so the artwork that you see, Benin artwork, traditional Benin artwork, that can be found in museums all over the world, including Chicago, Indianapolis, St. Louis, all of these objects that exist in museums today were confiscated, stolen from the British punitive expedition of 1897. And there have been attempts to repatriate these, but of course the Benin Kingdom no longer exists ostensibly, and they do not have enough of a kind of political or economic force over the British or other people throughout the world to restore or return those royal treasures that were once theirs.